Hey, oh sorry. My name is Patricia. I quit working at ShopRite and now I make $65 per hour. How? I'm working online. My work didn't exactly make me happy. So I decided to take a chance on something narrow after 4 years. It was so hard to quit my day job, but now I can't be happier. Here's what I do. Great thing about is that the only thing necessary is basic typing skills and access to internet. Find link and go. buzzbees4.com.
Welcome to Free Thoughts from Libertarianism.org and the Cato Institute. I'm Aaron Powell.
And I'm Trevor Burrus.
And joining us today is Tim Sandifer. He's a principal attorney at the Pacific Legal Foundation and heads the foundation's Economic Liberty Project, which protects entrepreneurs against intrusive government regulation. He's also a Cato Institute adjunct scholar. Today, though, we're going to be talking about the politics of America's second best sci-fi media franchise, namely Star Trek. In a recent article on this topic that you wrote in the Claremont Review of Books, you make the provocative claim that, quote, the development of Star Trek's moral and political tone over 50 years traces the strange decline of American liberalism since the Kennedy era. So I guess let's begin at the beginning. The original Star Trek was a product of Cold War America. So did that, or how did that influence its political outlook?
Well, I think it wasn't just a product of Cold War America. It was also the product of World War II. World War II obviously was the worst catastrophe that the human race has ever experienced, and it dramatically affected the way that people thought about politics and about justice. And that those thoughts, I think, are found throughout Star Trek, the original series, which of course began in 1966, the brainchild of a World War II veteran, Gene Roddenberry, and many of the stars themselves and the writers were veterans. Jimmy Doohan, who played Scotty, was himself a decorated war veteran. So what you see throughout the show are discussions of ideas about human liberty, about justice and freedom that are rooted in what I think that the liberal West thought was the post-war consensus about justice, about human rights, about the role of the state, about technological progress and reason. And I think what you see during the 3 years of the show, the rise of the new left that rejected that consensus in large part. And you can see that permeating some of the episodes. For the example I give in my article is in the episode The Way to Eden, which is an episode in which the Starship Enterprise encounters a group of space-age hippies who are looking for some paradise planet of their own without any technology. And it's obviously a satire of the hippie phenomenon that was going on at the time the episode aired. And you can see the writers and the producers of the show, who are from that World War II generation, really struggling with how to deal with this new wave of thought that rejected the idea of technological progress, universal human rights, of basic liberalism that the older generation thought was well-founded at the end of World War II. I mean, here's the end of this war. They thought that the idea that all human beings have rights that no government may justly interfere with, the United Nations was going to lead to a worldwide liberalism rooted in technology and humanist values. And here comes this wave of opponents, and they really didn't know how to deal with that, I think.
So is it accurate to say, sort of to boil it down, to say that absolutism was something that kind of animated earlier Star Trek, that there were principles about freedom and rights that after confronting the Nazis, who had been very bad, that these were principles that were not relative, and so they were fighting for something in a way that was somewhat influenced by World War II?
Yes, that's right. I think a good example of that is one of the better episodes, The Conscience of the King, which is an episode that's sort of a play on Nazi hunting, because throughout the 1960s you saw these prosecutions of former Nazi war criminals, most notably Adolf Eichmann, but actually quite a few. Some of them were going on while this series was on the air, and this is an episode in which Captain Kirk encounters a character who's basically like a Nazi war criminal, and he's asked to track him down and punish him for his crimes. And the whole point of this episode is, who are you to judge? And which a character actually asks Captain Kirk, who are you to judge? And Kirk responds, who do I have to be? And that's the theme of the episode, is that everybody is subject to judgment. Nobody can escape by saying, well, it's just my culture, it's my society, it's a different time, it's a different place, you can't judge me. And I think the post-World War II generation that had seen the Nuremberg trials and so forth were very committed to the idea that all human beings have inalienable rights, and that no power, including religion, has any legitimate basis for trampling those rights or ignoring them. That idea permeates the original Star Trek.
Was that idea at the time unique to Star Trek and science fiction, or was this something that was just generally going on in the genre?
I think it was going on throughout television at the time. You see it in more sometimes cloying ways in some of the more tedious television shows of the time,
like Leave It to Beaver.
That's what I'm thinking. Is shows like Mayberry and so forth. They all had these very obvious morals, but the morals to them were things like, everybody deserves a fair trial when they're accused of wrongdoing, and that sort of very ordinary by our standards principles. But nevertheless, they were very committed to them. Star Trek tried to take those principles and twist them a little bit, and Gene Roddenberry actually consciously modeled Star Trek on Gulliver's Travels, which obviously was written as a way of talking about contemporary society and satirizing it or indicting it in different guises, and Star Trek did the same thing.
And the hopefulness too, that's another big element that Star Trek that permeates Star Trek, I would say, even currently, that there's a lot of hope in the future, and possibly in that post-war period, the hope, as opposed to any sort of dystopian type of future, like the idea that a bunch of people working together can fight for what's right and win.
That's right. It was very much an optimistic sort of welfare statist, humanist, broadly speaking, liberal perspective. My favorite Gene Roddenberry quote, I remember he said in an interview once, aliens in spacesuits didn't build the pyramids. Human beings built the pyramids because they're smart and they work hard. And that was his perspective. He thought human beings really could get past all the bad things in the world and could accomplish great things. Now, sometimes I think that sabotaged some of the dramatic possibilities of Star Trek. The writers of The Next Generation often found themselves having a lot of difficulty coming up with good scripts because Roddenberry kept vetoing ideas, saying, no, human beings won't have conflicts among themselves in the future utopia, and that made it very hard to come up with good stories for television. So Roddenberry at times went too far in his he often went too far in his utopianism, but when it was sprinkled in there, it gave it a real positive cast that I think contemporary Star Trek and a lot of contemporary science fiction is lacking.
Now, there's an episode that you talk about in your essay called The Apple, which you think is the quintessential episode of the original Star Trek. Can you tell us about that episode and why it is quintessential?
Yeah, so the episode concerns the Enterprise crew encounters a planet in which the people on this planet live in a sort of tropical paradise, but they're also deeply ignorant. They've never heard of farming. They don't know anything about technology. They don't even have sex, because it turns out that the planet is ruled over by this god called Vol, who controls everything that the people do through a sort of totalitarian mind control system. And he requires every day to be fed, and the people of Vol have to gather food and bring it to him. And he controls all of their thoughts and has reduced them to a complete lack of individual initiative. And the idea is they don't have any kind of conflicts among themselves. Everybody gets along, everybody's placid and peaceful, so isn't this a good thing? And Captain Kirk says, no, this is a bad thing, because it deprives the people of the capacity for thinking for themselves, living on for their own ideals. And the idea of freedom leads to conflict. You aren't going to have that placid quality of peace as a result of freedom. You are going to have bustling conflict, disagreement, dynamism, creative destruction. That's going to be what freedom is like. But that is what every sentient being in the universe deserves, is the right to try their hands at freedom. And so he orders the Enterprise to destroy Vol, which is in fact a sort of supercomputer that has been controlling all these people, and he leaves them to their freedom. Now, this episode seems to me the quintessential episode of Star Trek because the whole point of the series was about freedom and individualism and liberating ourselves from the dead traditions of the past, and recognizing that means there's a downside to that. We will have conflict, we will have trouble and strife amongst us, but the rewards of that freedom are worth the struggle. And I think a lot of people criticize that episode because Kirk blatantly violates the so-called Prime Directive, which is the rule that in Star Trek the Enterprise crew is never supposed to interfere with a native culture. But in fact, the point of Star Trek is that the Prime Directive is wrong, and that a native culture that oppresses its own people has no rights to do so, and that liberty takes precedence over these antique traditions.
So does that set up then, if the Prime Directive is, call it, what are the core values of Starfleet?
The Prime, we might actually call it the Prime.
Yes, and it's wrong. Does that make Starfleet the kind of organization that Star Trek the show is antagonistic towards?
Well, no. I think what happened is if you watch the original series episodes in order, you see that the Prime Directive was kind of introduced subtly in a couple episodes, and it was introduced as a foil. It's introduced for the dramatic purpose of breaking it in these original screenplays. The idea being that to sort of satirize or criticize the idea of cultural relativism, or the hands-off, who are we to judge kind of attitude. That is introduced purely for the purpose of criticizing it in the original Star Trek. Now, it grows in importance as the franchise continued its life in the 80s and the 90s. It grew in importance in the episodes until the point where in the Next Generation it becomes this mindless dogma where we're never supposed to interfere. In a section of my essay that was actually cut out before it was published, I criticize an episode of the Next Generation in which Captain Picard encounters a race of aliens who have been kept in a drug-induced stupor by another group of aliens. They've actually kept this one race addicted to a drug in order to keep them as servants, as slaves. When the doctor on the ship, Dr. Crusher, when she discovers this, she's horrified by it and says, well, surely you're going to do something to put a stop to it. And in one of the low points of the entire show, Captain Picard refuses to do so. He says, no, who are we to judge? It's the Prime Directive. I have no right to interfere. And he gives this ridiculous speech in which he says that in the past, any time that we've interfered with an alien culture, it's ended up badly for everybody. Well, that's completely false. In fact, it's contrary to the entire basis of the original series, which was rooted, again, in this United Nations effort to bring freedom and modernism and liberalism and technological advancement to the peoples of the world. And now here's Picard saying, no, if one man wishes to enslave another, no third man should object, to quote Lincoln. And that's Picard's attitude, hands off.
How does that play in? I'm curious in that so the original Star Trek is exceedingly episodic. There's not a lot of these. So one of the things that tends to turn me off a bit about Star Trek in terms of the world building aspect of it is that it doesn't feel to me like a universe that people live in and has a continuity. It's instead, each episode is we're gonna visit this thought experiment, and then the next week we're gonna go to another thought experiment. And so, do we have evidence that like the interventions that say Kirk did turned out well, or does he intervene, smash the computer, and then we never go back to that planet again?
Well, you're right. It's that way. And remember, Star Trek was the first science fiction series that was not an anthology. That's one of the reasons why it was